Good afternoon and welcome. The title of our panel today is Building Blocks, Applications for Better Business. I am Stephen Aschettino and I will be your moderator. I am a partner in the New York office of Norton Rose Fulbright and serve as the US head of FinTech. Let's introduce the panelists. First, we have Daniela Barbosa, who is Executive Director at Hyperledger. Daniela is the General Manager of Blockchain, Healthcare, and Identity at the Linux Foundation and the Executive Director at the Hyperledger Foundation. She has been at the Hyperledger Foundation for the last 4.5 years, working with the Hyperledger worldwide ecosystem. Hyperledger Foundation is an enterprise blockchain open source developer community and hosts various DLT projects like Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Besu, along with many other projects, including identity projects like Hyperledger Aries and interoperability tools like Hyperledger Cactus. Hyperledger Foundation is a consortium led by blockchain companies like IBM, Accenture, Consensus, JP Morgan, and hundreds of other global members. Next up, we have Alan Vey, who's founder and CEO of Aventus Network. Alan is a Forbes 30 Under 30 winner for his work as the co-founder and CEO of the Aventus Network. Before moving into blockchain, Alan worked at Deloitte in the entrepreneurial business department and macro hedge fund Brevin Howard. He completed a master's degree in artificial intelligence at Imperial College London. His master's thesis was on blockchain technology, during which he co-founded Aventus. Aventus is a customizable layer 2 blockchain network that lets users build on Ethereum and beyond at scale to process transactions at high speed and low cost. Duncan Johnston-Watt is co-founder and CEO at BTB and serves as a GBBC ambassador to United Kingdom. John deVadoss is founder and head of NGD Enterprise, and also a board member of GBBC. And last but not least, we have Jeffrey Saviano, Global Tax Innovation Leader at Ernst & Young. Jeff is the Global Innovation Leader for EY's tax, trade, and law business, as well as a fellow in the MIT Connection Science Lab. In his EY role, Jeff leads an advanced technology lab that develops innovative tech solutions grounded in advanced technologies, including blockchain. Jeff is also a founding member of Prosperity Collaborative, an open innovation collaboration, including EY, MIT, and the World Bank. So we clearly have a very esteemed group here today, so let's get started. We're going to start with a very broad question to introduce the topic. What is the current state of enterprise blockchain, and which industries have been the most ready to adopt blockchain to date? And if possible, if not asking too much, what do you expect to see this year in 2022? And if I can, let's start with Alan.
Hey, everyone.
Sorry, Daniela instead, I apologize.
Cool.
We have more for you, Alan.
Sure. Hey, and I first want to thank the GBBC for having us all here. I think Steve's point, we all wish we were in Davos having these conversations on a panel there, and then having the opportunity to spend time talking to one another, because it really is a critical point in the enterprise blockchain space that we should be very proud of. I've been here at the Hyperledger Foundation for the last 4.5 years. And I really believe that the foundation has had an enormous impact on enterprise blockchain since 2016. So, when we look at what the current state of blockchain, I think myself, along with our other members of staff, as well as our member community, really have a good touch point as to what's happening. In 2016, we launched with one project, which is Hyperledger Fabric, and it continues to be the most adopted DLT in the enterprise based on surveys and responses that we and others in the industry have gotten. And since then, the Hyperledger Foundation, much like the industry itself, has really expanded, right? There's leading projects here at Hyperledger in the enterprise Ethereum ecosystem, like Hyperledger Besu that Steve mentioned, which is an Ethereum client designed to be enterprise friendly for both public and private permission use cases. We've launched projects dealing with core technology that follow market adoption, right? Once DLT is adopted, what are the other things around around identity, around interoperability. So, I see this as a multi-dimensional technology adoption play and adoption across the board. So I'm pretty bullish on the state of enterprise blockchain, primarily because it scales, it's delivering results. Have things moved much slower than we anticipated 5 years ago, if we had this conversation? Definitely, but this is enterprise software. Imagine any type of enterprise software. It typically, we're here for the long run. And, I personally believe it's, a 5 to 10 year from here process that we do. The results, from a surveys, and if you talk to business and technical leaders, and we spend a lot of time talking to both end user company and technology companies, just like the Deloitte, 2021 blockchain surveys, that I think it was 80% or more of the respondents believe that blockchain technology is scalable. And I think that's the key thing about, the state of enterprise blockchain is that it's scalable, that it's usable, that it's achieved mainstream adoption for use cases. And our own surveys as well point to that. We did a survey about 6 months ago across all sectors, and about 55% of those said that they've either deployed production implementations of blockchain or are in the process of doing so. And those are much larger numbers than they were, 3-4 years ago, obviously. From categories, Steve, you asked what categories, where is it most adopted? We're seeing the top categories continue to be in financial services and supply chain, as well as identity. And I think that's a really core evolution of the technology, and where we do need to spend a lot of time. So trade finance use cases, for example, we all know the trade lens example, and on public record, they've stated that they've moved over 42 million container shipments already with their blockchain services. So over and over again, whether you're looking at trade finance networks like GSBN, which is doing cross-border network transactions in China and outside of China, these things are being adopted. Supply chain is the second one, I would say, that we see a lot of enterprise adoption in. And we continue seeing food and traceability projects, but also provenance and sustainability with use cases like circular. I believe that they were on a panel, or will be on a panel tomorrow, talking about some of their use cases around vehicle battery materials and conflict minerals. And the companies, the large end user companies, the cars, the manufacturers, et cetera, are participating as part of those networks. And last but not least, I think the adoption of blockchain related technology, specifically around digital identity. And we're seeing a huge increase in use cases, both at the government and the private sector, around creating digital trust frameworks. For example, in Europe, with the adoption of a lot of SSI, or self-sovereign identity solutions for government services. So I think it's pretty evident that the technology is scalable, that it is being implemented, and that there are ROI stories coming out of the industries on its support of being the technology of choice.
Thank you, Daniela. Maybe I speak for this group as well, but in 2017, I was co-leader of a blockchain practice at another firm, and I was seemingly traveling the country talking about blockchain, explaining to people what it was. And there was a tremendous amount of hype around everything to do with blockchain. If you added blockchain to anything, it became instantly more valuable and cooler. At the time, there was an expectation that everything was going to be on a blockchain practically immediately. And while clearly a lot has happened in the blockchain space, and Hyperledger seems to be at the center of much of it, we haven't seen the widespread adoption that many of us had expected back in 2017. Why is that? If I could ask Alan to chime in.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. Just first of all, just a quick thank you for having us here. I got to echo a lot of what Daniela said in terms of where the traction has happened, but why we haven't seen more. I mean, we started Aventus in 2015, the year Ethereum launched, and started looking for traction. We were one of the companies that did an ICO in 2017. But I think what we saw, and I think you might remember that year, or anybody who was in the industry that year does, the year started really strong, especially for wider use cases, lots of capital flowing into ICOs and sort of other investment. Middle of the year, around summer, was a little calmer, and then towards the end of the year, it exploded again. But the following 2 years were what we called sort of the crypto winter, at least on the public side, right? 2018, 2019 were very slow, or at least in terms of market cap. A lot of build and behind the scenes was going on. So I think it's like any new market where you saw a really big, people started understanding on a wider scale how much this technology could transform things, which meant the money was there. And because we didn't have regulated structures, and it was so easy for anybody to put even as small as $10 in any of these companies, and many people were thinking of it almost as shares in companies. So a lot of capital flowing in, but the market wasn't so discerning yet or understanding of good or bad projects. So there was a lot of scam, a lot of negative sentiment. We saw a lot of negative press 2018, and the market needed to recover from that. So from our perspective, that was a bit of an uphill battle, and a lot of people were still building during that time. You could do an ICO with nothing. You could have an alpha and raise $100 million, right? It was a crazy time. So it took time for people to build and catch up, those who were genuinely in it. It took time for the market sentiment to recover from people being scammed out of a lot of money from a lot of the sort of fraudulent attempts in the industry. And then really for the wider market to understand and regulators to catch up with frameworks that made companies feel more comfortable adopting it. So I'm not sure about the other participants, but we've found sort of 2021 and now moving into 2022 to be the sort of best years yet. Everybody's much more receptive. People are a lot less scared of crypto. It seems like less of a sort of dark marketing and more mainstream. So yeah, I think those are some of the considerations for why we haven't seen it sort of adopted faster. It takes time to build the new infrastructure ultimately.
Duncan, if I can ask you, at the time, harking back again to 2017 or so, blockchain was being billed as the solution to practically everything. Did we perhaps set our expectations a little bit too high?
Well, yes, obviously. I mean, that's the classic overexcitable, it'll solve everything by tomorrow. So I think what we've seen is to some extent a maturation, but also quite a clear distinction between the enterprise application of blockchain as a technology and its potential value creating new applications and services around things like crypto. And so I think there's been definitely a sort of quite distinct separation of concerns there. So the Hyperledger Foundation, of course, is very important in the enterprise space, and they look after a number of distributed ledger technologies. And as a member, we obviously are focused on trying to make those technologies easier for people to use and people to grok. So if you're an enterprise, you can get up to speed much faster. Somebody can give you the tooling to do that. But that's just one side of the coin. The other side is, the public blockchain space. And, I guess there was a feeling at one stage that there would be consolidation in that space. And I know, we were having a session here, a strategy session just the other day, and looking at the range of public blockchain options that, there are a wide range. There's Neo, there's Stellar, there's Tezos, there's Cardano, you name it. There's and there were some from that ICO spike who raised not hundreds but billions of dollars, like EOS. So I think there's what we're yet to see is any kind of, I would say, consolidation if it's ever going to happen. So there are lots of believers out there, but I'm not so sure that certainly in the public space that has become sort of a very clear. There's no obvious winner there, and so we will, I'm sure, get on to topics like interoperability later on in the discussion. But we've created a number of challenges or problems for ourselves, as technologies are wont to do, unfortunately.
Speaking of technology challenges, John, could you talk to us a little bit about potential scaling barriers and maybe governance gaps that have also been challenging?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Stephen. First of all, a privilege to be here. I want to thank the GBBC as well as my illustrious panelists. Perhaps just to step back just a little bit, Stephen, we talk about adoption of the blockchain platform. What is it about this platform that makes it distinct or unique or different? I think it's important to emphasize that first before we talk about the implications. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there are two things, Stephen. Firstly, in the history of computing, there has never been an economic platform, an economic stack, and blockchains are economic platforms. So what this means is enterprises, organizations that understand the nature of an economic platform are very successful in building institutions, not applications, but institutions. So what this means is obviously, as Daniela was saying, finance is a very big hotspot in this space because they understand the economic platform aspects. The second thing is, again, in the history of computing, we've had single party platforms. All the cloud platforms, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them, Google, they are single party platforms. But a blockchain inherently is a multi-party stack. It's a multi-party platform. And so what this means is customers, enterprises who understand the nature of multi-party interaction and economics, again, trade, finance, supply chain, are obviously very successful. And so for me, that is the context in terms of how we look at this particular space. Now, with respect to topics like scaling, governance, to me, those are in some sense incidental. I don't see them really as the high order bits. The challenge for us, I believe, is to ensure that the industry, our industry, understands what is it that when we say economic platform and a multi-party platform, and that's what's going to drive, catalyze innovation and growth and business value, as well as outcomes eventually in due course.
Thank you, John. He hit upon a few topics there. I think this leads into our next question, which is, what are the primary motivations for businesses to incorporate blockchain into their core infrastructure and processes? And have these motivations changed in the last couple of years? I want to see if we can go back to John for a minute, if we can. John, let's talk a little bit about the economics of blockchain. You mentioned it being more of a self-governing institution than an application. How does that factor into real-world decisions for businesses?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question and something I have a lot of passion for. So I spent about 25 years in the enterprise space, Stephen. I spent about 15, almost 18 years at Microsoft building, selling enterprise solutions to large corporations and public sector companies around the world. And so I've seen, for example, you look at compliance or the much abused phrase, aligning IT and business. Aligning IT and business, we've spent billions, maybe tens of billions of dollars with consulting and all the other, in terms of trying to get to a place where we can say we are close enough to aligning IT and business. Now, for me, what makes the blockchain stacks unique, again, is because we have the economic protocols embedded, intrinsic in it. Problems when we think of aligning IT and business, there is no need to align because they are inherently in the same platform, in the same stack, right? And that's kind of the things that we need to ensure we evangelize. And the same thing for compliance. In this space, compliance is not an overlay. It's not something we add on and bring after the fact. Compliance is something we architect and design, right into the systems we build. And that's why, for me, again, the lens is so different, so unique in terms of what we mean by an economic stack or an economic platform.
Duncan, do you have some thoughts about John's comment about the economic protocols being baked in and what the implications are for enterprise blockchains?
So that's quite a complex question, believe it or not, even though it was said very elegantly and eloquently. I would say that the multi-party aspect is incredibly important to understand. And that's really what we're really saying, and should be obvious to everybody, is that by its very nature, business, commerce, and even our interactions as individuals is multi-party and is by and large not something that should ultimately be governed by a sort of monolithic enterprise. This is why there is such a reaction to companies like Facebook and so forth. So I think it as a fundamental technology, as an enabling technology, I think it's very powerful to actually help promote a different way of thinking and developing applications. So starting out from the assumption that, multi-party is, in essence, the norm. I think there is value that you can extract, and this is where I would probably slightly disagree with John, and disagreement on a panel is no bad thing, is I think there is value in treating it as middleware, but I think it's also important that if you do that, you also understand the potential when you're looking at sort of new economic models. And in fact, can you marry the two? Because I think no enterprise is going to completely rip out and replace everything it's built and wasted billions of dollars on to date. So can we provide a way of giving people an on-ramp to the new ways of doing business, and also integrate that with existing systems where in some cases that's entirely reasonable to stay where it is. But anytime you want to engage with the wider world, with other companies or with individuals, then I think multi-party is the starting point and not something you should try and bolt on as an afterthought any more than you should bolt on security or any other fundamental feature as a quote afterthought. So so perhaps a more nuanced answer, but I think there's a lot of truth in what John is saying. Is it gives us a different way of viewing the world and our interactions with that world.
Thank you, Duncan. Daniela, if I can ask you, from where you sit at the Hyperledger Foundation, I'd be very interested, and I think our audience would be too, in your thoughts on this topic of businesses' motivations to incorporate blockchain and how they view the advantages.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the key things that we, spend a lot of time educating the market and these individuals, both at the developer and business, is on the importance of open source software development, because just what, Duncan talked about and John, these new economic models and platforms are being developed with consortiums, right? Companies that come together and they come together to form these business networks. And they are, the open source development processes that, for 20 years, the Linux Foundation has basically brought to market and educated companies with are very, very keen to what blockchain networks, how they should be developed and how they should be managed as we go along. So I think, bringing together organizations and individuals with different requirements, getting them to come and work together to develop these common solutions and the governance in an open way is really important. And it's a completely different way that businesses have done business in the past, right? It's not about the software or the scaling, as Duncan talked about. You could put middleware and make this happen, and you're kind of central to the networks. But the models that blockchain and what has been put into practice over the last 6 years or 5 years around how to build businesses, operational businesses with these new economic platforms and ways, I think is really important to follow through. And I think what we've seen over and over again, and we are hearing from central banks and government agencies, is that they want to build these platforms out in the open in order to be able to meet those needs, right? That they're just not going to go and work with one vendor to create middleware or software, enterprise software solutions that won't scale long term.
Thank you, Daniela. I'd like to bring Jeff into this conversation. And I love his title of Global Tax Innovation Leader. Jeff, if I could ask you, we're going to pivot this little discussion a little bit to some of the most pressing developments and challenges facing the ecosystem today. We talked a bit about scalability, so maybe we can leave that one aside for now. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what the most pressing developments and challenges are facing the blockchain industry today.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you. We haven't had enough tax discussion yet, so appreciate bringing that important topic in. And I'm really happy to be here today. I'm also really happy with the direction of the conversation today so far. And so many of my fellow panelists are using the G word, the governance word, as a major gap in the world. And just to pile on for that a bit, I think it's the greatest irony in blockchain development for decentralized systems that there's a strong need for some centralization up front, building teams. And Daniela, I love how you described the importance of building consortiums, and we're getting pulled into so many around the world, but there's a gap that, you put 20 people around the table, they don't know what to do sometimes. There's, key governance matters around decision-making and incentive mechanisms for multiple stakeholders to join, when to join. And what we haven't really talked much about is everybody on this panel is so bullish, myself included, an optimist at heart about the future of blockchain, but many of the systems have failed. When they fail, they probably fail because of governance problems more so than the bits and bytes of technology. So can't stress enough that as a community, the more time spent on developing governance frameworks for those enterprises coming together. Also want to highlight the great work at GBBC and the Global Standards Mapping Initiative. We participated in that. I led a team focused on public finance and tax and trade matters. And what we found, and if anybody's interested, happy to send to you the report of, if you're interested in public finance and how blockchain is being used for finance and tax, we wrote a paper on the 6 considerations and what you have to think about. But actually, the appendix is getting greater attention than the report did. And the appendix is a chronicle of, we studied and we looked all corners of the world, under every sofa cushion we could find, to find blockchain systems in place solving public finance problems. And we found 26. We didn't find 100, but we didn't find 5 either. We found exactly 26. And I think 3 years ago, there would have been just a small handful. So it's happening, and really give GBBC and the GSMI effort a lot of credence, because it's getting strong play around the world. And in addition to public finance, teams highlighted 8 other areas as well.
Thank you, Jeff. So my practice in particular focuses on payments technology. So I've been looking at blockchain through that lens essentially since 2009, when Bitcoin was invented. I think we'd be remiss in today's discussion if we didn't talk a little bit about the role of digital currency in today's iteration of blockchain and the future state. And I'd like to get Alan's thoughts on perhaps the ongoing discussion about CBDCs, which are central bank digital currencies, stable coins, and digital currency integration in general.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we ourselves don't directly handle many payments, but what we do obviously at Aventus is build additional functionality on top of the blockchain to try and service different sectors, right? Whether it's loyalty, supply chains, video games, NFTs, all kinds of different applications. So, and one thing that we always bump up against, whether it's a CBDC or even just normal digital currencies or other kind of tether-based currencies, having the ability to actually observe a transaction happening within a blockchain network is very valuable, because of the things that you can kind of build on top of that, right? Right now, a lot of the problem, especially on the sort of public blockchain side, is the problem of the oracle. How do you actually get information into that self-contained system, and especially pricing information, transaction data? A lot of different financial tools or smart contract-based parameters would trigger based on this information. And when you don't have a reliable source, or you don't have it directly reported from the source, certain economic incentives can come in the way to sort of gamify systems. And we've seen various hacks that have happened because of this. We've seen all kinds of issues that have arisen. So I would say, to really nail blockchain adoption beyond just some of the core use cases that we've seen of like crypto and payments, we need to get this bit done properly on the blockchain. It's great to see the adoption of sort of Visa and some of the major card networks doing this. Once you're actually able to examine those transactions and completely trust that data having been provided, because it's all dealt with, sort of the source of truth is the blockchain itself, you're not reporting on a source of truth from elsewhere, then we can really build further things and get around some of the problems. So that's one of the key things I see, especially from building out wider infrastructure and how this can help.
Jeff, from where you sit, I'd be curious to get your thoughts. I suspect EY has some views on the tax implications of programmable currencies and the like, and would love to get your take.
Sure. Well, first, we're watching the CBDC versus stablecoin, and Myself wondering if we'll have a VHS versus Betamax moment in the world. Maybe I'm showing my age with that, but can they coexist? Can we have multiple countries issuing CBDCs? And we already have stable coins in circulation today. And from a programmability standpoint, we're extremely interested. My own opinion, I think from the tax and trade and public finance, this will be one of the most important disruptions in the next 2 to 3 years, let's say. The opportunity through smart contracts to actually program events directly into currencies. We're excited to help simplify taxation, reduce fraud, reduce the time that goods are spent at the border, and the importance of, in some cases, eliminating current technology that's perhaps a bit clunky and not interoperable. Multiple systems, how do you collapse that and incorporate events directly into currencies themselves? And, Steve, I find having this conversation with executives and our clients that there's certainly a barrier to get over, and just getting your head around what do you mean by programmable currency, and the opportunity to, through smart contracts, actually program those events determinations. And I think that there's an education and knowledge sharing that has to happen. Of course, opportunities go beyond just tax and public finance and trade, but that's where we're starting. We're forming working groups around that, and are very close to developing proofs of concept and starting an initiative to actually demonstrate and show how taxation could be simpler through programmable currencies.
Thank you, Jeff. If I can go back to Alan for a minute. Alan, do you believe that we currently have, that blockchain technology offers sufficient speed to handle the type of volume of transactions that you've typically seen card networks and other traditional sources handle? There's been some discussion that speed isn't there, but I think that perhaps that might be slightly misinformed.
Yeah, so I think here it's important to assess the use case, right, on whether you're going for a permission and more restricted network or a public network, because it is easier to achieve scale with fewer participants. So the less people that are actually involved within a network, it's just kind of a computing problem, right? The more people who are involved in achieving consensus, it can be harder to scale those systems. So I think the problem is slightly easier to solve when you have a permissioned network with fewer number of nodes than an open public network. But even in the area where it's the hardest to solve the problem in completely open public networks where anybody can kind of become a part of it, I believe, theoretically speaking, the industry has solved this, right? We see all kinds of papers, all kinds of different approaches, people promising upwards to, 60,000 transactions per second, theoretically, which is beyond the Visa MasterCard networks. However, given the level of traction so far, I think very few people have actually proven this in production. And the difference between theory and idealized scenarios for a product versus actual production is vastly different, right? There's just so many unknown unknowns that you can't test for. So I think this is part of the rollout. I think we will see some issues. I know we've seen certain people with issues. Most recently probably was the sort of gateway API for Solana going down that I saw, and various issues to do with load on systems. But the problems fundamentally have been theoretically solved. So I think it's just a matter of who has got the proper discipline. Obviously, with all the money and the ability to push out quick press statements and see that reflected in tokens or in stock value, you see many public companies just adopting blockchain, even though they don't have a use case for some bump. There is a conflict of interest there to a degree at times on actually properly using the stuff, but it should be solved theoretically when we get to the point of actually rolling things out properly on the public perspective. I think that's where you'll separate the sort of really fundamental value projects versus the ones that are more hype and whatnot. So that's my 2 cents on where scaling's at today. Thank
you, Alan. Let's move to the next question, which is, what role does open source play in the development and adoption of blockchain solutions for businesses? I believe the Hyperledger Foundation has been, this is probably understating it, having discussions with central banks about blockchain adoption. I'd love to get Daniela's take on this question.
Sure. I mean, I'll just reiterate what I said before, specifically around open source development, as open source development being a transparent process, which is very fitting for blockchain technologies, whether it's CBDCs or supply chain networks, really being able to do that in the open. And it brings organizations and different individuals together and drives them to work together to develop these common solutions. The thing I'm most excited about in the Hyperledger community, and the Hyperledger community is very large, right? There's a lot of other ecosystems that touch our ecosystem, even public networks, et cetera, is that there are a lot of examples of either in production or in POC stages at the central bank digital currency use cases that we're all going to learn a lot from. So since 2020 here at Hyperledger, we had a panel in early, I think it was December of 2020, where we started talking about central bank digital currencies and what the processes were, who we're working on. And since then, there's been so many use cases that have brought forward different approaches, right? And they're really different approaches by technology choices, but also importantly by what they're trying to deliver to the end customer, so the consumer itself. And I think what's really fascinating is the businesses and the opportunities on building on top of the CBDCs that we can have. So even here at Hyperledger, we are doing this in the open. We've gathered many of our members in our community. There are multiple, the Eastern Caribbean Dcash central bank digital currency uses Hyperledger Fabric, while the National Bank of Cambodia uses Hyperledger Iroha, and the Itheon Leon Rock with the BIS uses Hyperledger Besu. These are all different approaches with similar end goals. So doing that open and then coming together as a community to share that work and to develop upon that work is really premised to the core of open source development. And I really believe that what the Linux Foundation, Hyperledger is part of the Linux Foundation over the last 20 years, has brought forward to all different types of technologies is going to apply in this space as well. And what we're hearing from the central banks and from other key stakeholders that are working on CBDC and stablecoin projects is they want to be able to use open source processes for development of code, but also the development of the governance of these platforms as well. So doing that in the open is really going to be, I think, a key thing that in 2022, this year, we're going to hear a lot about. And I certainly welcome everybody who's doing work in the space to come over to Hyperledger and read that work and get involved in those communities doing that work.
Thank you, Daniela. Question for Duncan. Alan before made an important point about a distinction between permissioned and non-permissioned blockchains. With regard to our discussion now of the importance of open source in the blockchain space, do you see a distinction for non-permissioned blockchains?
I think we have to be careful here, because when cloud first emerged as a technology, everybody was wild about public cloud, and private cloud was considered false cloud. At least it was, as far as Werner Vogels was concerned, until it suited him and AWS to then say it was the most wonderful, wonderful thing ever, and everyone needed to now do hybrid. So I actually think, these distinctions can get in the way. I think the more important point is the one that Alan made, which is, is there some form of governance around membership or contribution of nodes to a network? And in a permissionless network, you can rock up. By the way, don't try it. You'll melt your laptop if you try and join one of the public blockchains and imagine you're going to actually sort of host a node. But leaving aside the practicalities of that, it's completely open. Whereas in a permission world, there is some form of management of who is actually, it's a consortium, who are the members of that consortium, and who is therefore allowed to sort of provide nodes and contribute those to the distributed ledger, which incidentally is probably a better term in many ways than blockchain in that scenario. But if you're relating this back to open source, I think open source is in many ways 21st century alchemy. It's something which really has sort of opened our eyes to the way in which we can collaborate on projects. And in something like the case of DLT or blockchain and associated technologies above that, I think I am deeply, deeply suspicious of somebody who says, I have a solution, but it's proprietary and you can't look inside, you can't open it up and have a look, because that's bullshit, I mean, which is a technical term, by the way, so I'm not swearing, but, I think open source is in fact something that absolutely is fundamental to these collaborative initiatives, and that's irrespective of in the end how you're rolling out your DLT or your blockchain. So I think it encourages collaboration, and collaboration is I think essential to this. So I'll I can go on about that, but I'm fully paid up member of the open source community, have been for many years, and the Hyperledger Foundation is just one of the initiatives we're involved with on that score.
Thank you, Duncan.
And Steve, let me just add one
Please.
thing, because it's the audience might not know the distinction of open source, where I'm a company, I open source my code base, I put it on GitHub, and everybody could take a look at it and see what's going on, to open governance of open source, which means that the maintainers and the governance of that code is not owned by one company, and I don't need to go and work with one company and buy an enterprise license of that code base that is open sourced on the GitHub. And it's the governance, and it's really important to understand that. And Steve and I had this conversation before the panel, the central banks and the government entities understand that. It's taken them a while, but I think they're understanding why open source in its way, when it's governed openly, and has optionality for commercial vendors to support, becomes more and more important as we build these critical systems, these economic platforms, as John said, right? This is going to be our future of how we move money and make money in everywhere.
I think we have to leave it there because we're out of time. But I wanted to personally thank all of the panelists for participating and lending your incredible expertise, and also thank the GBBC for allowing me to moderate this esteemed panel.